you doing today? Nice shirt.
We have one more lecture to go. Then we'll have our panel discussion. And then if anybody wants to say something, they can take the microphone. And then we'll dismiss the seminar this afternoon, or this afternoon. I'm trying to ride motorcycles this afternoon. Got to get out the turbo today. Got a turbo. Turbo Kawasaki. Got 180 horsepower. For 750. Yeah, well, I haven't cranked it yet hard yet, but it's as fast as my 1100 inches. It's a fast direction. That's nice too. Nice bike. I was supposed to get a D-Max. Yeah, I know, but I was on the D-Max. D-Max is a big bike. It's a special one. Probably. Danny, we're talking motorcycles. You're missing all the motorcycle conversation here.
Two more now.
Get fast. Tony Fontanelli. Tony, come on in here. I want one of the exhibitors to say something, but I don't think he's here, so. Deborah, would you see if Tony Fontanelli is back there? Carefully doesn't break your legs, though. That's a joke, Italian joke. Guys are slow.
It's a slow room. It needs some steam.
I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. David Russell. David, over the past several years, has sent me patients. He called me several years ago and introduced himself, and he said, my name is Dr. Russell, and I work in Europe, and I work in the United States, and I do this. I found what he did very interesting and fascinating, his line of work. And his background is too complicated for me to even remember his CV, so I'm going to allow him to introduce himself. That's what he wants. So I'm going to put Dr. Russell on now. Some of you people from town know him, and maybe some of you people from out of town know him too. He'll be lecturing on, what was your title we gave your speech? Integrated Systems in Classical Medicine. So without further ado, Dr. Russell, I'll give you the mic. Thank you. So we need this.
Well, it is always quite difficult to introduce oneself, and I did have another colleague that said he would do that, but I'm rather used to, I guess, introducing myself, even though it's very difficult. My background is different here. This is my first time speaking to a group such as yours here in the United States. I was born in the United States, but I'm Danish and have lived most of my life in Denmark. I just recently moved to the United States. And my training, I'm a doctor of Chinese medicine and Islamic medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, and Tibetan medicine. I am also qualified as a classical homeopath in Europe. And I work primarily in Europe and now the United States and in Southeast Asia. As I will hope to communicate through what I want to present today to you, there is some difference in backgrounds and perspectives on these things. Our training is quite different. The training of classical doctors is somewhat different than the training of MDs. It takes quite a longer time to be trained as a classical doctor. I've been studying for about 30 years now, and some of the parameters are quite different, and I will get into that as we go along. I've been teaching medicine and spiritual psychology in these three parts of the world for the last 25 years. The last 17 or 18 years, the integrated medical clinics that I've set up in Europe have mostly been concentrating on immune deficiency diseases like cancer and MS and ALS and all these good things we've heard about here this weekend. And as I said, I've recently moved over here and I work in this area and also in Tucson, Arizona, where I have my residence, and also still in Europe. I would like to thank Dr. Chris Husser for one of the things I have to apologize for right away, my translator sometimes doesn't work. So I kind of think with an accent, and it sometimes gets in the way. Dr. Chris Husser for making it possible for me to be here today, and of course for the wonderful hospitality of Carol and Ed Arano for considering this. I'm kind of I've been going back and forth thinking about how I feel about this after being here this weekend. It goes back and forth between sort of like feeling like being the token black, in the group here, or being Daniels in the Lion's Den. I'm not sure which one of those, maybe both, I'm not sure yet. But I would pray for your indulgence for my presentation. I think it's going to be considerably different than anything you've heard this weekend, because it is going to be presented around the perspectives of classical medicine. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce you to this. I'm not sure that you're really very familiar with the concepts of classical medicine, the paradigms that we're using. But let me just start with something a little provocative and say that we've heard a lot this weekend, a lot of very, a lot of real genius in the research and the work being done by the people that have presented these different categories for us this weekend. And one of the interesting kind of anomalies in this is that when we're talking about different types of presenting pathologies, especially in things like that used to be called immune deficiencies like ALS and MS and cancer and pervasive allergies and things like this, basically degenerative type diseases. One of the interesting anomalies that I find that many people in the United States aren't too familiar with is that in the field of classical medicine, I'm sure that we have about the same type of curative statistics that you have in using these same perspectives and parameters and techniques that you do here. The integrated medical clinics that I've set up in Denmark, there are currently 3 of them. When we work with patients like this, we have statistically a cure rate of about 80%, between 80 and 90% on all of these types of diseases, which is which is a pretty normal kind of statistic, I think, also for your people working in this other way. However, the anomaly, and the interesting thing is that we're doing this both from a diagnostic standpoint, a research standpoint, and a treatment standpoint, which is diametrically different. We have absolutely no concept of microbes. We do not use the concepts of microbes or tissues or things like that, or blood panels or anything in the type of diagnostic work we do. And of course, the treatment work we do is, in classical medicine, we might say only deals with supporting and working with the organism's own innate resources in transforming and healing itself. And that means they're extremely non-invasive. We do not use any form of supplementation, as is known over here in the United States. We do use some things called whole food supplementation, which is quite different than vitamins and minerals and chelation and that sort of thing. In terms of the therapies themselves, I use low potency homeopathy, or rather low potency potentized remedies. I am trained as a classical homeopath, but I do not use the classical homeopathic models in either diagnosis or treatment. And the reason for that is that even Samuel Hahnemann, this was back in about 1814, 1816, said himself that after all of his work and all of his triumphs, as a matter of fact, in the field of medicine and bringing homeopathy into Europe, had said that he didn't feel that homeopathy could cure chronic diseases. And we know, of course, that's not really true. However, there's a certain grain of truth to it in terms of the methodology. Using the simile, the methodology of simile, which is so sacred to classic homeopathy, really doesn't work well or well enough on a clinical level when you're dealing with chronic diseases. And that's because of the nature of the deep complexity of chronic diseases. That is to say, if you're going to heal people based on a very simplistic form of therapy, which of course is the goal of all classical medicine. The minimal therapy and the most simplistic that you can possibly get is basically that transformative power of the living organism to actually perform its own cure. And therefore we use that. What I do is I potentize remedies, again, I say in low potencies, but I'm using basically the Tibetan and the Chinese and the Ayurvedic models for how these substances work and what they do. And that gives a little different approach. And that makes it very viable in curing these rather difficult degenerative diseases. Now, that's one thing. The other thing is that as practitioners that we have to face is that practicing medicine is essentially a philosophy. We call it a science, but we have to remember in French, the Latin concept of science has to do, scienza has to do with vision, has to do with seeing something in a particular way, in a particular perspective. It doesn't matter what kind of doctor you are, what kind of therapist you are, everything you're doing is first and foremost based not on an immutable fact of reality or truth, but in your particular way of seeing it and understanding it. In the reality of a situation in a living organism, and this does not matter if we're talking about a cell or a microorganism, or we're talking about some particular biochemical component or process, is so utterly chaotic, so utterly uncertain, and so utterly complex that we're only noticing very few parameters about its true and full reality. Out of those parameters, depending on which way we're looking at it, we evolve a system, and that system becomes our medicine in the way that we address these things. But that's where these particular anomalies come in, is that it could sound, if you're talking to a real orthodox classical doctor that you just cannot cure anything without using qi. That's it. No end of discussion. You might get the same kind of discussion from a microbiologist or an alternative allopath who would claim to the last dog is hung that diseases are caused by microbes, and that only by dealing with parts of processes in this very typical Cartesian philosophy of our anatomy and physiology as we know it in allopathic medicine is the only possible way to do that. Then everything else, we look at our language, I've heard the word a couple of times this weekend, everything else is anecdotal. Now in English, correct me if I'm wrong, but English, the word anecdotal is usually something pretty negative. It's sort of a thing you do on late night talk shows. You know, it's kind of a half joke. And that fits in very clearly with what Descartes himself said, as you recall, that anything that you cannot ascertain through the senses, that is to say, weigh and measure and determine the truth of its reality, is to be considered untrue and therefore unworthy of any scientific merit. Ergo becomes anecdotal. And it just seems to me, interestingly enough, that when we're dealing with linguistics and medicine, that 3/4 of the world for the last 200,000 years has been using anecdotal medicine for curing all of its people. So there must be something to it. If that's the case, then we need to really investigate that. Now, let me go a little further into some of these concepts, because I really want you to understand that classical medicine is not at all like allopathic medicine. And what we've heard this weekend here is alternative allopathy. What I mean by that is, again, speaking of the philosophy, it's not so much a matter of what you do that makes you the doctor you are, but it's what perspective, what philosophy you have that determines what you do that is the difference. And this is obviously a conference of alternative allopaths that we've been to this time, and that's why I beg your indulgence, because I'm going to be presenting something a little different to you. Now, these things are not in opposition to one another. That's another thing we have to learn, is that this is not a matter of who's right and who's wrong, because there's no such thing. It has to do with a great challenge we have today in medicine as practitioners and as researchers. The great commitment that we have to all the suffering in the world is to put our very best efforts as human beings, as persons with the particular gifts and the particular insights that we've all received and are all extremely valid, putting these together and working on them in an integrated sense. It's not a matter of who's right and who's wrong in this sense. It's how do we bring these various gifts to work together and to become real blessings for our work together, for the sense of our integration of our knowledge, and how this is going to ultimately put the patient in the center, how it's ultimately going to benefit the very person that we're committed to helping. So I am not going to be presenting anything alternative to the alternative allopathic things at all, certainly not in any form of a confrontation about these things as being, but again in a very complementary way. But in order to do that, I'll have to have your patience, and it might be somewhat trying for you in the beginning, but give it a try. Try forgetting everything you've heard this weekend for a moment. And then letting it, and then listen to what I have to say, and then sort of let your knowledge, your previous, sift back into that, and see if that doesn't have a sense of integrating a little bit in this. Now, to illustrate the difference between very generally, between classical medical philosophy and science and allopathic medical science and philosophy, we can use the old Taoist parable of considering a jug, a clay jug. Visualize a clay jug there, if you will. We could even use this whatever kind of metal can here. Now, there are two simultaneous things going on in that which are absolutely necessary for the very being of that vessel. The allopath will look at the jug, at the vessel, and when asked, what is that all about, he will begin immediately to take it apart, break the clay and begin to analyze it, measure it, see how big it is, how much it takes up in space, what it weighs, what the constituent parts of how it got to be like that are. Very careful label and going through some very excruciating protocols and finding this out to make sure they really know what's happening. The classical medical doctor will look at that and see the space inside and say, what really makes this vessel is not the clay on the outside, it's the space on the inside, because the space on the inside is actually its purpose. It's actually its being. That is why the clay on the outside is forming itself that way, in order to give a purpose and a goal to the space inside. And as you know, you can't analyze space, because space is the ultimate complexity that contains every potential of every potential that could ever be. It's the universal field in quantum physics out of which all quanta or all phenomena arise, and to which all phenomena, irregardless of their manifestation, belong and relate to. It is in the chaos and unity theories, it is the underlying unity, unifying aspect, which is within and of all manifestations, all identities, all phenomena, and brings these things together. So when we're looking at the human organism as doctors, and we're looking at the phenomena, what we call medicine, you see how differently it is that we're looking at those things. The classical doctor is looking about how phenomena emerge out of the purpose of space and its unifying qualities. The allopath is looking at what are these phenomena when they do emerge. How do these phenomena relate to each other? How do you identify them? What are their identities? And what are the relationship between these identities? Now, is one of these approaches right and the other wrong? Of course not. They're both ultimately very complementary. In Europe, it's been possible for us in a historical sense to really set up clinics of true integrated medicine, where doctors like myself are working from this one perspective, and then we have the alternative allopaths like yourself working from the other. And we find some really tremendous inspiration and results from doing that. Better, of course, than we can achieve alone on our own ground and our own purposes. Now, we might say, again, I want to go into this a little bit in the philosophy of this to make it more clear. Classical medical science is the science of relationships, and the language of classical science is metaphoric. Now, why metaphors? Because metaphors are the only linguistic units that can at one and the same time carry a meaning and a purpose, but without being so limited in the structure of their definition that they actually limit the way that the definition itself functions. And that's very important. Let's see another thing. The sciences of quantum physics and fractal geometry, which we have today, these are the sciences which have finally given classical medicine its own scientific language in the Western world. All of this other stuff I've had before quantum physics and fractal geometry really became somewhat known here in the Western world. I had to do these lectures all in Sanskrit or Chinese or Hebrew, because they were the only terms that you could use to structure a communication that actually had the fullness of the purpose and the potential of what you were trying to say. But now the scientists in quantum physics and fractal geometry have come along, and through their investigations and research have found exactly these same models that we use in classical medicine, and have used terms that we now understand a little better. chaos and unity, for example, self-same and self-different systems, the concept of complexity and uncertainty, which are principles not of medicine yet, but of physics and math. But we find that those Western sciences are the ones that have given classical medicine its ability to communicate in these Western terms. So classical medicine uses, like quantum physics and fractal geometry, uses metaphors to describe processes, because metaphors are much broader and talk about energies and transformations rather than about strict phenomena. In this sense, the learning and the process of working in classical medicine has to do with the consciousness and the expansiveness of the mind, of the conscious mind. In allopathic science, you're dealing with forms and identities. And this is very sensory. It's not metaphoric, it's sensory. Just look at the tools of allopathic medicine: the microscope, the blood, and what we've had here, microscopy, blood analysis, x-rays, MRIs, all of these things. What are these in reality? These are extensions of our senses. They make our eyes bigger and sharper. They make the computers, they make the ability of us to sift and adjust and look at a lot of material much easier, much quicker. It's all sensually based, which is, of course, the Cartesian, Newtonian basis of all scientific philosophy. And in this sense, it has to do with the intellect rather than the consciousness, we would say in a psychological sense, and it's also reductionist. And of course, it has to be that way because when we're talking about phenomena and identities as having separate identity, self-sameness, then we're talking about reducing universal principles to individual identities, and that means it's reductionist, whereas classical medicine works basically the opposite way. Now, as I say, if we keep looking at that illustration of the jug there, you need the space, the expansiveness of the consciousness, the metaphoric principles of dynamic interaction and change and relationship in the space of this jug, and you also need the framework around it to hold and to qualify what's going on inside. So these things are ultimately complementary. They're not in any way, how do you say, would you say antagonistic? I'm possibly not. I'm fishing for a word there. Now, I'm going to, my notes have been so sporadic here. I'm going to have to put my spectacles on. All right. Now, classical medicine assumes, like the jug, that the patient, him or herself, is the loci of all causes, irregardless of what they are. And the patient is likewise the loci of all healing, irregardless of what the methods are that is used. We do have these strange ideas in classical medicine in which we say, of course, the therapy, any form of therapy, irregardless of what it is always artificial, in the sense it's always externally imposed, it's always creative, and it all is not life. Therapy does not heal. Therapy is not life. Therapy is a creative transformation of certain principles that either support life or do the opposite. But that the actual healing itself is only mediated in some form or other by the therapy. The therapy itself is not the healing agent. It is the organism itself that is the healing agent. It's an old European holistic medical divina afflictio, the divine affliction, meaning that in classical medicine, it's the pathology itself which is the great healer. Contains the medicine, contains the transforming, the dramatic, confrontational, and transforming elements that change lesser life into greater life. And therefore, we are not allopathic in the sense of anti-disease or anti-pathology, but we are Ayurveda, that is to say, for life, working with the wisdom of life, including what we call pathology, in order to create greater health, greater wholeness in the individual. Now, in terms of working in integrated clinics, I hope that what I do in talking to you is have you begin to understand and perhaps become a little inspired and interested in this whole field, this other form of philosophy of medicine and healing, and medical sciences. But at the same time, of course, it's not a panacea. When I mentioned before that, generally speaking, we're getting about 80% curative rates for all the things we're working with as regular general practitioners. And of course, I must come with a caveat to that. In the United States, I'm not a doctor, and I don't heal anything, and I don't diagnose anything, and I have no idea what I'm doing. So that's just to get the record straight, especially when it's on tape. As soon as I get into Europe, then we're considered to be regular doctors. We work for the regular health systems. I teach interns in the medical universities, and I do a lot of specialized work in the medical clinics and hospitals in Denmark, including training programs for nurses and everything else. And of course, our salary is paid also by the government, as it is with all other doctors. So, but these things with borders, you come over here, and so it's that's what you call international medical pleomorphism. So over here, I'm a very non-pathological little fellow that would never do anything like practicing medicine without a license. But over there, we become very dangerous. Now, but my point is this. I'm worried not about the 80% of the people that I'm able to help in these things. I'm worried about the ones that I'm not successful with. That's the interesting part. The other part I almost take for granted, because if I'm doing this correctly, and that I do feel this is my calling, it's an art, just like regular allopathic medicine is. We're called personally to this. There's a reason why we're doing the one thing rather than the other, not because the one's right and the other's wrong. It's just in a sense, a reflection of who we are. And so it's not only a belief system and something you practice professionally, but always, why isn't this working when it should? And I've come to not a conclusion, but a kind of an idea, which I think sort of explains through my 25 years of clinical experience, kind of explains why, at least for me, why this happens. I find that when I'm dealing with patients who and very difficult to describe, but who have, I'm sure you've met these kinds, who have very significant problems in the makeup or the deep psychic makeup of their characters and their personalities, something Wilhelm Reich called character, I'll just say in English, well, a type of character armor, which he also called body armor, Kroppspanzer, that had a very significant aspect. In other words, the patient's attitude on a very deep psychic level was so wounded by life that their ability to metabolize with life on a very holistic and a very large scale, not only metabolizing but in a biochemical sense, but metabolizing on emotional, mental, spiritual levels was very, very significantly blocked. In some areas in Europe, we call this type of personality self-destructive. It doesn't, we're not talking about suicide people here. We're talking, because that's something entirely different. We're talking about a particular type of biological attitude. Those people I find that I have virtually no success with, almost irregardless of what I do with them. And those people I refer to my alternative allopathic colleagues who have tremendous success with them. And I always think to myself, why would that be? And my conclusion for Luby, or so far, is that what happens there is that the healing of the organism must take place within the body. It can't take place outside the body. But the self-healing properties and possibilities of the body, when we're in that type of relationship with the patient where we're really working together on their process, and they are doing the medical work. I'm doing the inciting, if you might say, or the mediating, but they're doing the healing. Their own little apothecary inside and their own little things is doing this, and I'm just supporting or inciting that to happen. As long as that part of them or those processes are intact, minimally so, they'll do that. I've healed people, and I'm not, and please don't misunderstand me, I'm going to put this exactly in English. I'm speaking more or less not only for myself, for this whole field. We've healed people with very desperate degenerative diseases with placebos. We have done some things that surprise even me, because I know I didn't know what I was doing, but that worked anyway. Also in some of these things, ALS and some of these, and cancer. I've had cancer patients so far gone in the terminal phase that they were comatose, and in 14 days up, totally cured. And I said, from the allopathic standpoint. Now, is that something to my credit? No, of course not. As a matter of fact, that one, it happened once to me. I was desperate. I couldn't find, through my diagnosis, I could not find what was wrong. I mean, I knew the cancer, but I couldn't find the therapeutic point of reference in anything that I could think of. So in sort of a desperation, I went through a test situation, very much like Dr. Klinghardt showed us the other day, and I found a remedy that happened to be tuberculinum 200C. And I thought, this is impossible. That is absolutely ridiculous. But I don't want to tell anybody. I'm going to do it anyway. This is not right, but they're expecting me to do something. One dosage, and that's what happened. So, again, it's not my credit. It's just saying it's interesting to observe something like that happening. Now, where did all that come from? You know, how is that possible? One dosage of tuberculinum C, and we're talking about very gross tissue damage in the aorta and in the the adrenals. And so what I'm saying is there are things that are going on in this wonderful human organism that we really don't know. But when it gets past the minimal point of some type of whatever we might call a gestalt, a desire for life and growth and maturation, whenever that becomes too stifled because of any reasons, whatever they happen to be, then we must become surrogates for them. And that's what allopathic medicine and alternative allopathic medicine really do. In other words, if the organism cannot dissolve its own tumors, kill its own bugs, or resolve its own tissue problems itself through these other ways, then we have to have a surrogate. We have to have a material that will do it for the person. And we find something interesting about all of the nature of allopathic remedies. And that is to say, irregardless of their alternative allopathic or if they are regular mainstream, I almost said mainline, I don't think that's the right word to use for these guys, allopaths, and that is that the dosage always exceeds the body's ability to integrate it. And that's one of the secrets of how this stuff works. Now, it's supposed to be like that. If the body could integrate it, it wouldn't do it. See? Because it's not natural. the body, the organism, in its deep, deep wisdom. It's the wisdom of the consciousness of the universe. In its deep wisdom says, no, this is not natural. We don't do it like that. So if it could, penicillin, for example. So penicillin gets in there and says, oh, wait a second. This is not how it's supposed to be. This is not how we do things. So if it had a chance, it would just, the immune system would get in there and take care of that penicillin. It would never have a chance of doing anything for the patient. So the dosage has to be high enough, it has to be provocative enough to overpower the organism's own healing mechanisms. In other words, it becomes a surrogate for it's a substitute. It's the healing substitute. Now this really works, thank goodness, because that's the idea of the Cartesian philosophy, is being able to manipulate and being able to control functions. And that's very appropriate in medicine in certain circumstances. It is extremely inappropriate, another accent there, extremely inappropriate in other circumstances. That is why medicine has to be integrated. There is not a single solution for any of these pathologies. There's not a single solution for any problem. There is only a creative and poetic solution, something that we need to use our wisdom in. We need to seek a deeper and more conceptual understanding of what it is we have to do, and therefore being able to see the values in these different sciences and the different applications. When is it appropriate to use what? How do we combine these things for the good of the patient? We still have that hurdle to historically, as professionals, we still have that hurdle to go over yet. It's not very good English, but I think you get my drift. Now, that's kind of how I see where the successes and the failures of these areas are coming in, and how we need to do them. That's why I'm so very thankful for my alternative allopathic colleagues, is because there is that chance for my patients. I don't have to say, I don't know, this is not working, I can't do this, and then come with this very typical thing that many people use, you're incurable. You know? Or, too bad, you've got this, what everybody knows is an incurable disease. You've got ALS or cancer or something. Too bad, well, luckily enough, we all know this is terminal, so, you know, I'm not responsible for your problem. No, now we have, of course, possibilities in this really integrated community of doing the appropriate thing at the appropriate time for these people. Very important. Now, just one last little thing here about this philosophy thing. It's kind of like, I was thinking, sort of like a telescope or how to call binoculars. It's sort of like when you're zooming in, like a zoom lens, either zooming in on things or zooming out on things. Allopathic medicine zooms in on things. It's sort of standing out here, and it goes like this. Looks at this little detail. It gets closer and closer and closer, and it gets all these details. And suddenly, this massive details. This is what in physics you call chaos. There's this absolute massive detail that becomes so indeterminate because of the very massive detail that you have almost very difficult to predict how this stuff really is and what it's really going on. Classical medicine does the opposite. It zooms out. We get further and further and farther back. The details start disappearing, and we start seeing patterns. That's what happens in fractal geometry. That's why fractal geometry is so a very important part of our new physics today, because we need to understand that there are details. But when you're looking at details, this is also one of the principles of quantum physics, you can never be in two states at once. It's sort of like this photon. If you're looking at details, that's all you're going to see. You are not going to see perspective, because there are no perspective in details. That's precisely the point of them. If you're in perspective, you're not going to see details because you're seeing the patterns. Now, classical medical science is decidedly a science of patterns. A really top master of Ayurvedic science, Ayurvedic medicine, doesn't have the clue about what a cell wall deficient organism is. Doesn't need to either, as far as that science goes in curing these things. On the other hand, a bacteriologist in the allopathic form knows a tremendous amount about these little organisms, these little critters, but has absolutely no concept whatsoever of the true nature of qi. And does that mean one's right and others wrong? No. This is the case for integration. This is why we must get together, translate each other's texts, listen to each other's insights, and put this together in a practice for the good of the suffering people that we are supposed to be dealing with. Now, I know there's something else here somewhere. Yes. Let me just use an illustration before I get into this thing. I really wanted to present this idea of the immune system, and I will get into that. These cell wall and cell wall deficient organisms, if we were looking at this from a pattern standpoint and not from a microbial standpoint, we'd see something very interesting. Dr. Phil Hauschka, I believe his name, last name Hauschka, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, gave us some very good orientation about these organisms. And you remember what he said. This is very interesting to me when he was talking. The cell wall organisms are very highly metabolic in synergy with the host's complex goals. I mean, if we look at it that way. They're extracellular organisms. They have a lot of enzymatic properties. They have antigenic properties. They go into some type of metabolic relationship which provokes an immune response with the host. Now, immune responses in classical medicine are true healing responses. They're not pathological. We do not consider them to be pathological. We consider them to be transformative, metabolic, and healing. And therefore, we know that in classical medical terminology, all microbes actually cooperate with the biological organism's ability to mature and change and grow. In other words, to become more whole. They're not looked upon as being pathogens. And so we see that the identity, once you have a cell wall, let's look at that gestalt, the form. When you have a wall, a cell wall, you have a very defined identity, very defined form, very defined identity. So you have the microbe itself with a very formed identity, and you have the host with a very formed identity. Therefore, you have the possibility for a mutual relationship. That relationship works towards the goal of the synergistic goals of life itself. In other words, an always growth and maturation towards fuller ways of expressing being. Now, the cell wall deficient organism, what it does is shedding its identity, its ability to be a shaped and formed metabolic organism. And as Dr. Hauschka said to us, these cell wall deficient organisms, they do not provoke primary immune responses. They don't have these highly metabolic aspects. They don't have antigenic properties. They become intercellular rather than extracellular, which in other words means they become symbiotic. There's a symbiotic relationship going on. Now, symbiotic relationships means the loss of or the detriment of one of the two identities in the relationship. We also know this from psychology. Now, we can either look at these organisms doing this and say they're just looking for a free meal. They want to find something to attack and devour and have it good and have it. Or maybe that's not their motivation. If we look at the entire microflora of the planet, we have to say some interesting things about them. They are life itself. They have the greatest life ecological wisdom of any life forms at all, much far beyond ours. It is the, we might say, the microbial wisdom and the way that the microbes throughout evolution have created possibilities for our metabolism. Our metabolism, our use of oxygen is microbial. Our ability to use heat and metabolize it, microbial. Our ability to create relationships with metabolistic processes are microbial. The wisdom, the biological wisdom in every one of our cells, in the mitochondria, which is basically a primitive bacterial form, is microbial. So I don't think these microbes are out to get us, no matter how it looks. I think there must be some other motive in evolutionary life about these things. Now, one of the things we know that bacteria do, bacteria or microbes, is that they're also the ecosystem's sanitary men, the garbage men. If it wasn't for microbial activity, everything that ceased to have an identity, that is, it dies in an organic sense, this world would have been filled up with organic garbage so many millions of years ago that life would have been extinguished as we know it on this planet, except for the microbes. Now, human beings have a tendency to be very special egotistical. That means that for some reason we think we're exceptions to the rules. I would challenge you to, when we're thinking about these cell wall deficient organisms that seem to be, flooding through our biological systems with such persistency and so pervasively these days, I would suggest to you that we've become the garbage. And what I mean by that is, nature has no mercy. I can't say to some high court up in heaven, I can't say, well, make an exception for me. Don't have these bacterial garbage men come in and take care of my body, which means I'm going to have to dissolve because I have created a situation which is untenable for life in me. I have just eaten too many McDonald's hamburgers. I've gone to too many conferences at casinos in Reno. I come from a country, or live in a country where men walk on the moon, but you can't drink the water. No. Where we are curing ALS by all kinds of things, but most people are constipated. No. I can't claim an exception to the rule. And life is getting in the way, unfortunately. It's saying the decisions you've been making in this country, I am so shocked. The vaccinations, the dental work, all the things we've been talking about. The over-the-counter drugs, the fact that statistically in this country, everyone over 50 is on at least 2 prescription drugs. And just on and on and on. Look at the laws you have for your agriculture, which are almost non-existent in terms of what people are eating. It's unbelievable. The electromagnetic, the geopathic, all of these things. We're creating this. We're creating a living organism, that is to say ourselves and our neighbors, that are so non-living that nature is just going to have to get in there and clean it up. And that's what it's doing. It's saying, you no longer can do this, we've got to do it for you. Now look at the membranes. Look at the membranes in the cell wall deficient organism. They're lipoids. Now what are lipoids in their archetypal sense in physiology? Lipoids are saying, I have the energy. Lipoids contain this real strong metabolic life energy. So they're saying, I don't trust you with it anymore. I need it for myself. So instead of the carbohydrates and the peptoglycines and all these other things in the regular cell walls, now they're just lipoids. And that does not work in metabolistic synergies at all. And as this stuff gets into our, becomes part of our cell matrix, of our functional cells, we're going into a real state of problems there, which means a lot of idea of death. Now, why is that? You see, nature is trying to balance us out through these lipoids. If we look again at the perspective, not the details, but we look at the perspective of things, all forms of stress on living organisms have certain qualities. They are drying, they are fragmenting, they are dispersing, they lack solidity, they lack coherency. But mostly the idea of being cold and fragmenting and drying is very important. We know that cells in a living organism function only in the warmth of metabolism and the moistness of metabolistic products. Anything, any qualities which are drying, fragmenting, or cooling create death in mammalian physiology. Lipoids contain the exact opposite energy. Lipoids contain warmth energy, they contain coherent energy, they are the moist, wet cellular energies, and that means that the symbiotic relationship of life itself is transferring from us to the microbes. That's the way it should be in nature when we're destroying ourselves. When the stresses that we're creating on our physiological, psychological being are so strong and in such a universal sense that this is happening on a special level, that's what it's going to look like. It's not sneaky microbes, it's sneaky human beings, not respecting the nature of the gift we have received, which is our being, and how to live with that in a respectful and loving and caring way. That's what we really need to do. Now, if we open that up, which are the concepts of holistic or classical medicine, which are based on the perspective of life rather than on the details of life, that's why we need this integration between these things, then we will see these differences. Now, I've worked in hospitals in Nepal, where I did most of my Southeast Asian medical work. I've worked in the Ayurvedic hospitals there, and I've worked in the regular allopathic hospitals there. And I've worked in the villages medically. And great eye-opener after working in Western Europe and the United States prior to that. I was finally dealing with real diseases, typhoid, tuberculosis, dysentery, things, and basically that was about it. And I was able to use the old formularies, like I was originally trained in Tibetan medicine or Ayurvedic medicine. Some of these great old formulators, maybe 2,000 years old. This person has amoebic dysentery, or this person has typhoid or something like that. Use this and use this. Oh, well, we just mix that up and give it to them, and bingo, they're cured. Wonderful. Okay, no big deal. It's just like being a real doctor. I just write a prescription. Well, I know that. Use this, and it works. Right? But there's no medical presence there. None of these people we were treating, even with these diseases and even with these kind of results, which are so simple, using herbs, using the old repertories, which we can't do here at all. Not the same results. I'll get in that in a minute. That they didn't have these other diseases. None of them had degenerative diseases. When I first started working in Nepal back in about 1991, I don't believe that there was any case of cancer that anybody ever knew about there at all. There was no degenerative osteoarthritis. There was no heart disease. There was none of this stuff. There was, of course, typhoid, tuberculosis, leprosy, some parasitical disease, etc. And we were able to cure these from the old formularies without much of a problem. And it was amazing to me. And I thought, gee, these people are really healthy compared to what I'd met here in Europe. What I'm dealing with here are desperate degenerative immune deficiency diseases. not typhoid, not these other things, not amoebic dysentery, anything. And none of the old formularies work, believe me. I love classical medicine. I've learned all of the medical apothecary and alchemy from China, Tibet, India, Islam, and I've practiced in those places. And as soon as I get to the Western world, where we have such a great medical presence, where we're so healthy, because we have all these dentists and doctors and vaccines and things to take away our headaches, we're all desperately ill. And we're much more ill, and we're dying of disease. We're not dying of old age. I remember talking to when I was lecturing at the medical university in Copenhagen, and I was talking about the death process, and I had this young intern come up and said, he said, you can't mean that. People die from disease. And he was young, and I'm a little older than him. I remember some of my relatives way back in the old days. Just to show you how healthy I am, I'm really 85 years old, but I know I look younger. But at any rate, I remember some of my relatives dying of what we call in Danish, filled with the days. And they did not die of diseases. They died in their beds at home, in peace, and in full conscious process of something we hardly know about. This young intern had never seen that. Never, ever seen a person, never heard of a person who didn't die from a disease. And we are turning ourselves into this sewer of pathology through the way that we look at life. Not because there is some super microbe out there that has discovered how to invade our cells. We're creating this. And according to classical medicine, and we've got to stop doing that. We've got to stop doing that. That's why in classical medicine, when we've been teaching, I've been, as I say, qualified as a doctor in these different traditions, so I've had to learn each one of them separately. And I was very, very privileged to have being taught by masters in these areas. And every one of them was agreeing about the same thing. And that is that the master doctor, the true master, is a teacher, not a therapist. Because the therapist is necessary, but the cause of illness, the cause of disease, is in our ignorance and our lack of care, our lack of wisdom, our lack of understanding. And therefore, all of our work, we should be striving for wisdom, striving for a way to truly understand and become benevolent people who care for ourselves and for one another, and who know how to care for life itself. If we do that, that's what promotes health. And as an addendum, that's what also fights disease. Now, let me just use this little thing. Another thing you'll have to learn about classical doctors is that we're extremely primitive in our technologies. So I've been so impressed by this. Gosh, it's like watching cable television or something. These other people, they have these little lights and things go on and off, and you get, it's in color, it's wonderful. Thanks. Thank you. I just didn't want to distract you for a while. This is not just to be a big surprise or anything. Thank you. Excellent. I did have a nice talk with Christo just before this. Thank you. And we did agree that if it was okay if I came next year, that by that time I'd have something worked out that was a little more interesting. I want to have colored pictures too. That's really great. I do understand that I have to work a lot harder at this convincing you of things because, the presentation is so... I found that out in America, you really don't have to know anything about what you're saying as long as the presentation is great. And I'm not saying that happened here this weekend. I'm just saying that I needed an edge like that, I think. So... the animations, weren't those great? Wow, gosh. Well, no, I can't get into that right now. It's just not good for my mind. yet, but I'm working on it. The immune system. Now, the immune system, I want to go into this just a little bit from a classical medical perspective. Now, the immune system in allopathic medicine is always sounded to me when I read physiology and anatomy and pathology and that sort of thing, qualifying as a classical homeopath, which we had to do that in Europe, always sounded like some type of covert military operation or some type of textbook for a SWAT team. You know, it sort of sounded like that. And they use all these letters that are actually codes, and you have to know the code, otherwise you don't know what it is. And it always embarrassed me when I first came over to the United States and started practicing. My patients would come in, and I'd say, well, good day, and hello, and my name is David Russell, and please sit down, and what can I help you with? And they said, oh, I have OCID, or I have JFK, or I have, I'd say, and I try to say that it sounded like a lot of wisdom coming out of my mouth. Actually, I was fishing for time, thinking to myself, what in the world is that? An OCID or an FHA or so I said, man, geez, I've been everywhere, and I've been thinking, I've been doing, and I've been studying every night. I eat my porridge in the morning. I do all this stuff, and I've never heard of this kind of thing. These guys must be so advanced over here. You know, this stuff I've never heard of. I'm going to have to go back to school. And so I'd sort of work it around, and I'd kind of tell them, well, you have to have a little pity on me. I'm just one of these guys from Rikers Island, and I really don't understand English yet. What did you say you had? And they'd say, oh, you know what that means. It means being tired all the time. Oh, I see. Or then they tell me the translation. And I felt so very good because, I did know about that. We had that all over there. We just didn't have a code for it. And these codes are really great because, again, it's sort of paramilitary kind of thing. And that's how they describe the immune system. They even call it a defense mechanism. And they call things killer cells. You know, you can imagine this mentality going through the cells of your spleen, saying, "Come on, tiger, get him! You know, kill him." It really sounds like that. Now we've got this big problem, is that what happens there psychologically and spiritually, of course, is that what we're telling people in other terms is life is a very dangerous place to be. It's okay right in here, but boy, there are guys out there and there are threats out there, and we have to have an early distant warning system. We've got to get some nukes in here, and we've got to get this thing all set up because they're coming, and they're out there, and they're really smart, and they're really vicious. And little kids, you know, I love this American television stuff. Every once in a while I watch one of these shows, and the commercials in between that I've seen over here, so wonderful. Some clinic giving a weekend special on getting both your breasts cut off so that you can prevent breast cancer. I saw that once in Milwaukee, unbelievable. And things for the housewives where, you know, buy this kind of soap because it's filled with the greatest and newest antibiotics, and you see all these little kids out there playing. They're having fun. They're splashing in puddles. The dog's there, and they're licking on candy and stuff like this. And you see these gigantic microorganisms, coming out. It's sort of like Jurassic Park, you know, on a micro level. And then you put this nice stuff with some good scent in it and everything. You put this on your thing, and you're making sure your kitchen counter is preserving the life of your family. You know, I mean, this is kind of the way that we look at the immune system. Now, in classical medicine, it's never called a defense mechanism at all, because it is not defending the body or the organism against anything. We call it an integration system. It is the great system of wisdom of integrative relationships. It helps our organism mentally, physically, spiritually, physiologically, energetically, however you want to look at it. It's those components which help us in the emergence and evolution of our own identity to relate to metabolize with, to share life in a complementary sense with anything and everything. The immune system has to do with integrative systems in our psyche, in our spirits, in our souls, in our cells, in our tissues, in our biochemistry, in everything that goes. It's the way that we are able to integrate. It doesn't protect us. It helps us to become friends. It helps us to become fuller and more wholly and completely alive. Now, when the immune system is not functioning correctly for any reason, you get the opposite results. We suddenly get enemies because we can't relate. We can't figure out how to cooperate. We can't figure out how to create a synergy between you and me, between this life form identity and myself and my goals and my purposes, and how we share this unity of purpose and life. Now we suddenly become antagonists. Out of that antagonism becomes destruction or systematic symptoms or things happening because of the lack of this integration, not because of the lack of the fact that we didn't have the latest nuke set up to defend us against something. We don't want to defend against things. We want to embrace things. We want to live fully and wholly through and with all things. We do not want to live in little separate protected boxes like the Jews on the West Bank. You know, this is not a good idea ever, and it's not a good idea now. So as we look in the classical medical sense of the immune system being an integrative system, we see something beautiful about the wisdom of the body. We have to use three metaphors. Now I'm combining some of the Ayurvedic and Chinese things here just to make it a little simpler. By the way, in the folders here there are two documents that I wrote. Of course, I'm always so distracted. Well, not really distracted. Let's say alternatively focused, or whatever we might say. So I didn't put my name on them. And they're on these things just in a little more detail for those of you who might be interested in those kind of perspectives. Anyway, we have to use three metaphors, great metaphors in Chinese medicine called the triple warmers. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Chinese medicine, but these are metaphoric organs. We don't really have anything inside our abdomen called the triple warmers, these three areas, but they are metaphors, that is to say, they are aggregates of metabolic functions. The lower warmer, middle warmer, and the upper warmer. This is the origin and the mediation of the entire immune system according to Ayurveda, Tibetan medicine, and Chinese medicine. I want to explain that a little bit. The Chinese term for defensive, or not defensive, but how would you call integrative energy is Wei Qi. Now I won't go into the etymology of that, it doesn't matter. In Sanskrit, it's ojas. Means the same thing. Any integrative process of any kind, on any level, and in all of its components and constituents, those are the words. Chinese, it's Wei Qi, and in Sanskrit, it's ojas. Same thing, different cultures. Now, that obviously is the way that we integrate life, including the presence of all these microbes in us and around us, and our presence with them, and how we're going to get along in this world, this planet together, without destroying one another. So that's what we're looking at. Now, where does that come from? In the human organism, where does that come from? How does it work? This is a model of that. Classical medicine can fill in the holes. It has very specific scientific models for how these things work and how they're arranged, where it usually ends up in the allopathic circles of saying, well, we know this and this happens, but we don't know why. This is why. And a study of classical medicine, or becoming friends with a classical doctor, will also help you understand these processes. And that's why I say it's mutual and complementary, these things. The lower warmer is basically the kidney system, the bladder system, and the reproductive organs. Now, when we're talking about organs in classical medicine, we are not talking about a clump of meat. We're not talking about the anatomy we know. We're talking about that clump of meat, yes, but we're also talking about as a system of metabolic energies, which is not just the tissue of the kidneys or the bladder, whatever, but a whole system which stretches through the entire body-mind of the person, but which is centered in its physiological manifestation in an organ. So the kidney system, the bladder system, and the reproductive organs make up the lower warmer. Now, the energy systems in that is the origin of the ojas and the Wei Qi, of all immunity, including what allopaths call immunity. The origin, please tattoo this somewhere so that you remember it. The origin of all immunity is in the reproductive organs. The mediation of immune processes, spleen, liver, bone marrow, just like the allopaths say, correct. But the origin, the foundation of all immunity, the entire integrative system of the body and mind is in the reproductive systems. Now, why? And that's what controls them, the reproductive organs. Because it ought to be self-evident, the reproductive organs do not only produce new offspring on a phylogenetic level, but they reproduce us. They are constantly rebirthing us. We know we are losing millions of cells daily, dying. How do we get the new ones? They have to be born. They have to go through exactly the same processes, the same matrix of energy, the same configurations on these greater and cosmic levels of recreation, which is being reborn, which is a reproduction process. So the very organs in our body that are able to reproduce phylogenetic life, that is to reproduce a baby, also reproduce us, reproduce our minds, our spirits, our bodies, our emotions, our thoughts. It's the reproductive organ functions that do that. Now, therefore, in Chinese, it's what they call Jing Qi, which, and you don't have to remember that. Just remember it's the seminal energies, and that's what I just described before. The seminal energies are found in the ovum and in the sperm specifically, but these are archetypal energies which bring birth, which impregnate, which create new growth, which recreate things and reproduce things, and not just things, all manner of things, including thoughts and energies and everything else. That's where our integrative system actually comes from. Now, what that does, there's an extra meridian. We call meridians. These are just channels of energy. They're very specific channels. This is not just some kind of airy-fairy kind of new age stuff. This is believe me, it's real. The Chong Mai is a very special meridian, internal meridian, that circulates through all of the metabolic processes of the gonads, the reproductive organs, and they bring it right up from in there. It goes around and goes up through the lumbar, sacral and lumbar vertebrae, and goes deeply into what the Chinese call Ming Men, which means the port of life, the gate of life, which is the yang navel, opposite our yin navel here, the umbilical, it's the yang navel. This controls all of the upbuilding, all of the manifestation, upbuilding energies of the entire matrix of the mind and body. It goes into there. Then it rises directly up to the middle warmer, this Chong Mai, directly bringing these energies up there. The internal meridian of the kidney down here connects all of these three warmers. Now, why is that kidney meridian so important? The kidney system controls all phylogenetic energies, all hereditary, all genetic processes in the DNA and the RNA are controlled by the energy metabolism of the kidneys in the preborn and in the well-born. It is singularly responsible for these phylogenetic energies being able to configure with the energies of the newborn. And that means how we will live from the time that our umbilical cord is cut until we die biologically. That is the responsibility of the kidney system, regulating these DNA processes on the energetic and archetypal levels. And that's why the internal meridian of the kidney is the main thing here, connects these three things. The Chong Mai is actually a branch of the kidney meridian also. So now we come at the middle warmer. That's right up in here. This is what we call our digestive area. Stomach, spleen, and liver are the main systems having to do with that. This produces what they call in Chinese yin and blood. Now yin, it's called ahara in Sanskrit, and it says that all immunity You see this in both Chinese and Sanskrit. All immunity is dependent on the nutrition. And the nutrition does not mean whether you're eating grapefruit or potato chips. Nutrition means what you are able to metabolize, number one, and what you are able to integrate in that metabolism, number two. And that's how the concept of nutrition, which is spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical, and all those dimensions at the same time and simultaneously, how those nutritive events come from our ability to metabolize with the environment. Now, metabolism is a Greek word, metabolism, and means literally changing stuff. Now, Stoff, that's German or Danish too. That's not what I mean. Matter, that's what I mean. Changing matter, the transformation of matter. Now, what we're doing is all of these foreigners out here, all this bread and carrots and meat and everything, I'm hungry, want to eat. I need to eat. Something in me tells me I need to do something in order to stay alive. What am I doing? I'm changing matter, transforming matter with all of my friends and neighbors out here. They might be, it might be a hamburger, it might be a biological carrot, doesn't matter. It's this ability to have these relationships, to metabolize, to transform and retransform one another, which is the basis of life itself. It's a relatedness and the ability to have these relationships. Now, allopathically understood in the physiology, the ability to digest is the basis of the metabolism. But the metabolism itself is a relationship with much greater principles than just breaking down a bunch of carbohydrates or proteins or whatever. In a much greater way. And so this yin becomes the material part of the pure energy of the immune system. Then that happens by all of this product going up to what we call the upper warmer. The upper warmer is in this part of the body here. It comprises the lungs and the spleen, the kidney and the pericardium, and the heart. Now, also in this area, what happens is all of this stuff goes up like this, it gets into here, and then out of this upper warmer, all of the chi energies, the Wei chi and the para ojas, go out into the system and circulate through every cell, every tissue, and every mechanism of the body, which is what we call basic immunity in allopathic science. Now, this basic immunity, as you see, is the product of these things, and it ends up having the final metabolism up here in the upper warmer. The lungs and the spleen control all of the so-called etheric or purely energetic processes of the body and the mind. The kidney and the pericardium control all of the nerval or emotional or psychological relationships that we have in the human organism, and control the functions of the gonads and also the emotions in the psyche. These are the nerval parts. The heart is more what we call the mental aspects of the human organism. The heart mechanism controls consciousness and all cognitive facilities of the mind. Both, in that sense, the spiritual aspects as well as the mental, intellectual aspects of the mind. All of those things emerge from the heart system. All of these systems are up in this upper warmer. The Wei Qi, the integrative immune energy of the body, immune configurations, constituents of the body, go through this pathway and become refined more and more until they get up here, where they get imbued with the entire matrix of the individual organism. And it comes out as para ojas or Wei Qi and goes through the system. Now, para is a very interesting word in Sanskrit. Para means the essence, the quintessence of something. So this is the quintessential ojas, the most powerful. This is what defines our relationships, makes it possible for us to integrate and therefore not to be ill. Now, this energy is a very specific energy, and in Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine is termed as flowing through only 3 basic systems. The bladder system, which is the main yang system, so complete of all the organisms of the body. The tendomuscle meridians, which are special branches of the bladder meridian, and the divergent meridians. Now, what happens there, let me explain that just, I don't mean to be technical, but I just want to mention this to you. The reason for that is that all of the tissues, specifically in an anatomical and physiological sense, have to be able to be receive this Wei Qi and this power, which is just as we need circulation system, vascular systems in our body in order to transport nutrients and fluids and things like this. We need transport systems to transport primary energies. That's what these systems do in terms of immune energy. Now, the bladder system, the tendomuscle meridians, this has to do with skin, connective tissue, and permeates through the entire matrix of what Hans Seele called the primary immune system. The guy that got the Nobel Prize for what do you say in life? Stress of life. Right. Hence, exactly. Thank you. That's the thing he was talking about. Then every tissue system, every tissue system has what they call a divergent meridian. That is to say, it's running through the body through the superficial tissues, but somehow all of this Wei Qi and the power ojas that's in the connective tissue in the skin has to get into the vital organs. It does this through the pathways, the vascular, and they're not vascular, but energetic pathways of the so-called divergent meridians. That means that this Wei Qi and power ojas can go deep into all the viscera and work there. Now, what happens in problems of some immune problems, which is why you get the bacterial problems and why you get all kinds of other problems, including emotional and whatever? It has to do with this system. If you are doing something wrong or improper to the reproductive organs, and just think what we're doing psychologically and physiologically, we have single-handedly managed to cripple and make pathologic a whole species of human beings called women in this society with our birth control pills and our IUDs and our hormone replacement therapies and our hysterectomies, yes, and all these other interesting things that we do. What does that have to do with primary immunity? Basically everything. Not just immunity on a physiological level, but our ability to integrate anything. Why do you think they call it a hysterectomy? The old Greek word for hysteria. Because there is simultaneous and multi-level things going on all the time. There is no cell in the body which is not both simultaneously physiological, psychological, emotional, spiritual, mental. Not one. That's how the human being is made up, of this whole matrix, what it really is. We have to know that, we have to respect that, and we have to be able to diagnose that, and we have to be able to treat that appropriately and correctly. Now, kidney systems, the digestive systems. We've heard so much wonderful stuff this weekend from these different, very brilliant contributors about how all these things in certain ways fit into this, huh? The nutrition and the toxins and the heavy metals and there's all this stuff. Yes, that's right. This is where they're doing it, and that's why, very specifically, that this happens. Now, finally, we have to meet this part. Does it mean anything to our immune system, our physiological immune system and immune abilities, immune functions, how we think, what we do with our consciousness, what we do with the depth of the mentality of our humanness and our hearts, in other words, our spirituality? Does it have anything to do with our emotions? Of course it does. And we all know this, but classical medicine has a precise model to tell you, this is a sketch. Precise models to tell you exactly how each one of these things precisely fits into every type of biochemical cellular response or tissue system, and which form of microbe is going to be involved. And you'll see some of that information in the literature that's in your thing. That's why classical medicine is really quite a great contribution to the field of medicine, because it's able to do that. And now that we have the perspective, see, this is the zoom out thing. This is how it works. Now we can zoom in on the details, which all of our other esteemed colleagues have come with. Now we can look at the biochemistry and what happens in the cell and this and that, and get all lost in these details, because we need those details, but we also need the perspective. By putting those two things together, we're going to know in each individual person what to do, how to do it, and why we're doing it. And we're going to be able to do that with wisdom rather than just our intellect, which is, of course, what we're all really looking for and what we all really need. Now, let me just close by doing something here with, I think there's a little eraser here somewhere. Here it is. Now I'm going to do this very high-tech thing here. I'm going to erase part of this board. Thank you. Even the board is kind of shaky now. I was thinking about bringing my old board next time, but I guess I'm not. I'm going to bring one of those PowerPoint things, I guess.
Yeah, I'm going to count on it next year.
Right. Okay, thank you. That'll do. I think I can manage that. Now, because this is a dental conference, I decided that I...
Really?
Not really. Okay. Well, I thought I'd try to put something dental in here, just to, because I figured that I had to. They haven't paid for my ticket yet, so I figure I have to do this, because otherwise they'll say, well, sorry, oral cavity. Yeah, I think it will. Okay. Now, let me write it up first, and then I can. Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you for your patience. The oral cavity, the entire oral cavity, and we're talking about immunity in the oral cavity. We're talking about some very specific things. And why do things go wrong? I'm not going to go into the pathology, the dental pathology of why teeth start to decay and things like that. That's a whole other lecture. But we're looking now specifically at the immunity in the oral cavity, the entire oral cavity. The immunity and all immune processes in the oral cavity are controlled by the meridian of the stomach. There's a main meridian of the stomach, which we're not concerned with. It runs up here in the connective tissue in the bone of the jaws. It's the reason why we have TMJ. When there's a TMJ problem, it's the stomach meridian. And also the bone and bone loss and that sort of thing. But internally, in the internal tissues of the oral cavity, they're controlled by the distinct meridian, or excuse me, the divergent meridian of the stomach and the tendo-muscle meridian of the stomach. You remember that just before I said that the divergent meridians and the tendo-muscle meridians were the vessels that mediated or through which the actual defensive, or the chi, how would you say, the immune properties and the immune functions flow. Now, the distinct meridian of the stomach, the divergent meridian of the stomach, contains these following things. It contains the point, is connected to the point stomach 30. Now, in the handouts here, I have a document there called Qi Chong, which is stomach 30, a whole discussion about the concept of immunity and nutrition and how all this stuff works through this very important point of stomach, 30th point in the stomach meridian, down in the lower warmer. The reason for that is the Chinese have all kinds of wonderful little poetry. You see, they were so metaphoric that their acupuncture points, they don't list them like we do in Europe by numbers. They always had a name, a beautiful poetic name for these things. And this is the the birth of the child point, and the sea of nourishment. All of the things saying what I've said before. The birth of the child means not just the birth of the child, it means my birth. The blessed grandchild, that's me. I'm my own grandchild. In reality, in physiological terms, I am, or energy physiological terms. And also the sea of nourishment. Now in Chinese, when you say sea, you mean the origin, the thing out of which everything comes. In Hebrew, it's the ma'im, it's the water of which the Spirit of God hovered over, out of which all creation arises. That's what this point symbolizes and does and controls in that, and it's right down on the pubic bone here. So it's this divergent meridian of the stomach in the oral cavity is directly connected to this stomach 30, and that's in your material if you want to read more about that. It also has the spleen system and the heart system from the upper and middle warmers, and it has in it a bladder, the point one, the first bladder point up here. This bladder point is the entry point of all yang processes. Yang means this universal energy of life. The energy itself, the pure energy that motivates, moves, and makes any form of transformation and metabolism possible. That's yang. This divergent meridian of the stomach contains this bladder point, which means it's the entry of the possibility of all transformation and change to life. The oral cavity does that. Isn't that marvelous? Yeah, it's just a beautiful picture, beautiful poetry, and it's really, really true. Bladder 1 also directs all hormonal and metabolic activities in the entire body, because it also controls the pituitary from that point. The other meridian in the oral cavity, the only other one with the immune work, is the tendo-muscle meridian of the stomach, again. Contains the point 30 on the gallbladder meridian, which is down in here. That one point is responsible for the stability of all processes of the body and the mind. That one point. Let me tell you an anecdote about that. This is really an anecdote. It's because it's not scientific. This is not an anecdote. This is pure science. Okay. Now, I was in my clinic one day in Copenhagen, and I got a call, an emergency call from a young man who was at the airport. He had his fiancée with him. His fiancée had been let out of the hospital, out of the mental hospital, for 2 weeks to go down to Greece and have a vacation with him. She was a catatonic schizophrenic, had been under treatment for, about 5-6 years, and she went into a catatonic state just as getting on the plane in Greece, coming home to Denmark. The young man did not like the fact that she was always doped up all the time and kept in isolation in the loony bin, and he had been thinking about alternative treatment. So not being able to get in touch with her parents or anybody else, being on the plane from Greece, he called me up and said, when I get off the plane, if I get in a taxi, could I come over to you? If I don't tell anybody, and we'll see, could you do anything for her? And I said, well, bring her over. And he actually sort of half carried, half moved this person in an absolute catatonic state. into my consultation, put her down on the table, and I used that point, gallbladder 30, as well as 2 other points, which are basically well, not a technique, but I was using the perspective of Tibetan acupuncture rather than Chinese at the time, or for her I was, because it was more concise. 3 needles, no stimulation, 2 millimeter penetration, passive, the thinnest Japanese needles possible, which means that the stimulation was almost 0, into this. Let it sit for 20 minutes, and in 15 minutes, she was perfectly well. And she stayed perfectly well for a whole week before she went back into the mental institution and started getting the drugs again. Now, again, this has nothing to do with anything to say that I'm a brilliant acupuncturist. What I'm pointing out here is this is how it works. This is how it works. The wisdom of the body is so profound that when we understand it, these very minimal things in this extremely complex organism, just the slightest touch. This fits in with quantum physics and fractal geometry, by the way. The idea of the, I'm sure you've all heard this, the dragonfly wing somewhere in the jungles producing a hurricane somewhere else. This is really true, on this level, not just metaphorically, but about this unified field of things happening. These minimal stimulus being able to take these gigantic patterns and radically change them around because of the wisdom of the body and how these things work. But that point, that's why I mentioned that anecdote to you, is because that point has that's up in the mouth also, not the point, but that point's energies pour into and reflect into the oral cavity. It also, the whole bladder system and the spine. Now we know this, of course, from the tooth reflexes. You've got wonderful, wonderful charts out there with all the ontodons and all these kind of things that Fall and all these other pioneers have brought in. Yes, it's all there. And Rain-Mai 3, that's just another yin kidney meridian, one of the main life meridians of the entire yin system of the whole body and mind, which means the whole reason we're even manifest, that we even exist in a physical sense, is because of this meridian. And it reflects in the oral cavity into a point in the yin meridian about 1 chun, which is just like a thumb thing, above the pubic bone in the center line of the body. That point governs all energetic transformations of any kind of process that you could possibly imagine. Now, in Chinese medicine, we deal with what, I know you've heard the word qi before, but what you're probably not aware of is that there are hundreds of different kinds of qi, each one doing a particular thing or having a particular area of influence, and very different from one another, both hereditary, presence, functional, constitutional. I mean, it's a very great science. But this one point controls all of the transformative processes of qi in the whole organism. Now, all of this stuff is up in the oral cavity. The oral cavity itself has a direct reflex, physiological reflex, to the pelvic area. So we have a mirror when we're looking at the openness of life to sharing life with the environment. Our 2 openings are in the oral cavity and in the pelvis area. The ingoing and outgoing life, the sharing of life. There's a direct reflex on all levels of this. That's why you people are doing such fascinating work in the dental field, in the holistic dental fields, because when you see this whole life reflected in the oral cavity, it's not reflected in the humerus or in the tibia or in the gluteus maximus or anywhere else, but it is reflected in the oral cavity. Now, how very, very important and major a thing it is in the field of dentistry, of really truly being able to help and contribute to a person's life and health through what you're able to do in this so important. Just look what's in there, what we're really dealing with. So we need to be tender. We need to be careful. We need to understand how this works so that when we're looking at the oral cavity, we're not just looking at cavitations and root canals and mercury, which we also are, undeniably very important, but we're not only looking at that. So we see how these things work and connect and what we need to do and the care we need to do and use to do these things and the wisdom we need to use in order to really be there for our patients and with our patients, and how significant your help is to them. Very, very important. Well, that's basically all I have to say, and I'm sorry that I've gone on like this, but
Any questions? Yes.
I hope you realize, but do you realize you have actually endangered yourself for saying the whole thing here you have just said? Because when you mentioned that this is a dental conference, well, we said this is biological dentistry, we're supposed to be into the natural healing part of it. Now, this convention had actually designate, or I should put it this way, the main theme in this convention is to kill the germ. It has three major sections talking about the pervasive nature of still organisms. So what you are saying, I'm not saying you're wrong, don't get me wrong. You are right. I am going to ask you second question. Are you the teacher of Andy Whale? So don't think I'm saying you're wrong, but in reality, what we have experienced is, are we here to preach and to learn a natural healing of the dentistry? Or in reality, we might be at a certain level that still yet superficially and not to the root of the real dentistry. I mean, natural healing in dentistry. Because we are in reality talking about how to use whatever we have, material, mineral, to kill, to try to produce a germ-free mouth. Almost. I'm not completely saying this, but that's how I feel. How I have felt in this whole convention is we are teaching and preaching how to kill the germ in the whole mouth, producing a non-probiotic mouth. So I'd like to know how do you interpret, how do you make the connection between your natural healing, wonderful lecture, to the whole main theme of this conference?
Oh, all right. Thank you for that question. I'll answer it in the sense again from classical medicine. The wonderful information that we've received at the convention here, especially about these cell wall deficient organisms and what they have to do with the oral cavity, we were zooming in on them in the details. Let's sort of zoom out on them for a moment and look at them in a perspective rather than in a detail. What we see there, and someone brought up, I think it was Dr. Klingert, I'm not sure, someone brought up mercury, not just as the amalgam fillings, but when they said this about someone asked a question about does mercury fillings have anything to do with these kind of things in the teeth, and the answer was an emphatic yes. Well, I would go one step further. Not only does it have to do with amalgam fillings, mercury, the actual metal, presence of the metal, but it has to do in classical medicine with what we call the mercury principle, which is not just we might say that the mercury, the metal, the stuff you put in the mouth, is the manifestation, the physical manifestation of a universal principle. That universal principle is in classical medicine is what we call the mercurial principle. Now, What is the Mercury principle? The Mercury principle is the life giver. In Sanskrit, Mercury is called the sperm of Shiva, because it's the life bringer. It is a fluid-like archetype which in European alchemy, it's also called the whore of all metals because it binds, it's extremely valent, it binds with everything except iron. It just, binds with it, making some kind of third compound, which is even worse than the beginning, sort of thing. And why does it do this? Because the mercurial principle is a principle of unbounded life, unbounded vegetative processes which are linked to the archetype of the plant kingdom. What that means is that all mercurial processes are going to continue to grow and produce and grow and produce without any limit until you're so overgrown that you die of the lack of limitation. All of life has this very, very interesting aspect that on the one hand there are principles of growth, and at the same time, in order to stay alive, there has to be a limitation to that growth. Otherwise, we just keep expanding growth, and we die of that. If the other forces of limitation are too then we become too limited. Now, these stealth organisms are mercury principle organisms. They are growth life organisms. They're mercurial principles. That's why they react with the mercury in the teeth so much. They're mercurial principles. They're just going to keep going. They're going to keep spreading and growing and growing and growing, and nothing's going to limit them. They're just going to go and keep living and having a good time and just getting bigger and more and more and more, because there are no limiting aspects of life. Now, what are the things that are the limiting aspects of an organism? The mind. The mind is what brings the expansive growth processes which are unconscious. As soon as you make them conscious, you turn the energies entirely around. So in the human organism, the balance of the mind, which is not a mercurial process, or mind processes, mental, conscious process, whatever you want to call it, and the mercurial growth processes in our metabolism, those two things go together, balance one another, and produce what we call organic life in the higher complex mammalian organism. Now, what's happened is that our mind has become so fragmented, so deteriorated, so incapable of projecting concepts, thoughts, which are metabolically relevant. That's just another way of saying spiritual. Metabolically relevant means that we can exchange being, exchange thought, exchange gifts. That's what metabolism is. Our minds get in the way of that and break down that aspect. So what happens? Life has to go on. We're not going to be able to stop it just by being stupid. So the vegetative mercurial processes take over. And we're just going to get all overgrown by these parasites because something's going to live. And that's how the microbial world gets rid of the garbage. And that's why I'm saying we are truly becoming garbage. So there is a very clear relationship between bacteria or microbes of any kind and the human being. Now, also in the handouts I have, there in the other one, I believe, the oral cavity and something or other, I can't even remember what I put in these things. I wrote them rather hastily, but they're some of the work of Gerd Rüger-Hammer in Germany. Very new, absolutely marvelous research about the three germ tissues in the embryo, and the bacteria and the virus and the mucobacteria and the emotions and the mind and the tissues and the healing phases as go through. It's in there. I give reference to that. That's where that connection comes in very, very clearly. Yeah.
Wow, thank you.
I have three very short questions. You
You said in the beginning, and I'm sorry I missed part of your lecture because I had to go to the airport. You said in the beginning that in your clinic you have 80-90% cure for degenerative diseases. My question is, what is your definition of cure from classical medicine? The second thing, which is very close to it, you called symbiotic relationship of cell wall deficient bacteria and white blood cell. My definition of symbiotic probably different than yours. I also want to know what is your definition of symbiotic relationship. And the third question is that you said that homeopathic medicine can practically take care of any condition in any stage, if I understood it correctly. What about the application in critical care?
Yeah, thank you for questions. No, I think possibly I either misspoke or didn't speak clearly enough. I didn't mean to imply that homeopathy as an applied therapy could cure any or all conditions of anything. No, not at all. So if I gave that impression, I apologize for that. That's not correct. The first question, let me see, had to do with this cure rate. Yes, that's an interesting question, because what we define as a cure is, well, let me start from the other point of view. The standard, the typical allopathic, I'm not saying that for this community, but the typical allopathic definition of a cure is the reducing of symptoms to zero. Your healthy person has no symptoms. A sick person develops some kind of symptoms of some kind. When they're cured, it goes back to zero again. No more symptoms. That's the definition of a cure in allopathic medicine, standardized. In classical medicine, that's not true. We see that the disease itself, or whatever the pathology is, or whatever, we see that as a healing process, as a medicine of growth and expansion for the person and for the organism. And therefore, when we talk about healing, we're really using that term in its more etymological sense as a holing. So when we're talking about healing a person, we are not talking about just getting rid of their symptoms. We're talking about the fact that all of their faculties, after the cure, are more pervasive, more integrated, and more whole or more alive or more usable or available to the patient than they were even before they got sick. In other words, there has to be some real quality development of person and organism that has to take place rather than just a reduction of the symptoms. Now, also in terms of these cures, one thing I should say, again, this is not just myself, I'm referring to a person, I'm referring to this field or this particular way of working when I'm talking about these percentages. It's the same thing you have. I mean, anybody who's doing good clinical work is doing this kind of stuff. Now, what I didn't mention is that sometimes I have to take 6, 7, 8 years to achieve this. And again, all of this is different. I've had some chronic sinusitis patients, not even allergic rhinitis, but chronic sinusitis that's taken me 4 or 5 years to cure. That's awesomely bad. But not really, because it was a fight every inch of the way to deal with the origins of their particular chronic sinusitis. I've had certain cancer cases where I've reduced a tumor in like 14 days to nothing. You know? So who knows? You know? There's no rules, there are no laws. There are only individual manifestations of things happening. And that's what we always have to think about. We're not curing diseases, we're curing this specific organism who is living and manifesting a universe which is so complex we will never understand exactly what this is. We can only metaphorically get a view, a perspective, and then we zoom in on some of the details. We put these two things together and we help this organism achieve that. That's why we do need to work together. This last question was about the symbiotic relationships, yes. Now, symbiotic relationships in the way that I was explaining them or there mean usually in symbiotic relations which you have, it's not parasitical, and that's why I use it in these two different ways. It's symbiotic in the sense that one of the individuals gives up its right to self-manifestation and particular identity. In terms of the cell wall deficient organism, they're giving up their cell wall. That means they're giving up a very substantial part of their identity and their ability to metabolize with other organisms. The reason they're doing that is not because they're sneaky and bad and terrible, but because they're trying to help the more complex organism, which is us. Let's look at it in psychology. And I'm sure all you people worked with symbiotic relationships with your patients in psychology. What happens there? Very typical. The parents, two parents, the more complex organism, the host, right, are dysfunctional. The child is absolutely dependent for their life on the relationship of the parents to themselves. They're thinking in their unconscious minds, they're saying, this is not going to work. I'm pretty exposed by these people. They're so dysfunctional. God knows what they were going to do, you know? So I have to help them out. I've got to stop being me, because if I'm just being me and have this identity and I'm growing and kind of thing, and I have all this focus and things, I don't know what's going to happen with these people, and I don't trust it. So I'm going to stop being myself. I'm going to take off this cell wall, which is my own emerging identity, and I'm going to leave that aside. I'm going to have this little membrane, and I'm going to make some walls here that I can get right into these people, and I can start doing this work for them. I can be the one who will make the peace. I can be the one who won't do anything that's going to set anything off. I can be the one who's going to kind of go in there and try to heal this and mend this going on here. Now, we all know what happens. It can't happen. And what we end up with is a grown-up who doesn't have a cell wall because of their symbiotic relationships. They don't have this cell wall. They can't interact properly. They can't metabolize with other people or even themselves. These are the Charakterpanzer people that Reich was speaking about, and why those people are very difficult to help through these perspectives in classical medicine, because their own ability to identify with themselves as a healing organism is almost not there. So we have to use the surrogates. We have to go in with these really strong, invasive stuff and do it for them, like with the antibiotics or whatever. You know, that's just my opinion, but that's what. So the symbiotic relationship starts as some kind of positive motivation, but ends in, if it can't achieve its goals. If it cannot achieve its goals, then it doesn't work, because this does not create better families. This does not create better relationships between host and microbe. The only thing is, however, that nature works that way, and it's merciless. It's merciless in the sense, from our perspective, in reality it's the great good and the great mercy, but in our perspective as individuals and egotists, we look at this and say, why can't I be the exception? Like I said before, why do you have to do this to me? You know, I want to have one of these kind of relationships, you know, and I should be okay. You know, give me, you know,